Let's face it, none of us likes a strange bathroom. For certain, shall we say, private functions, we prefer a familiar setting. Tell the truth, do you avoid public washrooms because they're dirty or because they're alien? But no matter how grungy a public washroom might be, most of us would rather use one of them than be forced to use an outhouse. I was tired of being locked up at home and wanted to get away from my tiny apartment, so I jumped at the chance to use a friend's cabin situated around 20 miles out of town. Of course, I had envisioned a lovely log cabin with all the modern conveniences, but instead, I got a shack with an outhouse. The shack was serviceable enough. It had a bunch of appliances from the 1980s and didn't appear too drafty. I hoped. It was March, so it still got pretty cold at night. But the privy was another matter. It smelled so bad, I was surprised I didn't melt when I walked up to it. Indeed, the green paint was peeling off the wooden sides. The door had the cute traditional half-moon symbol, but inside was a rude plank with 2 large smelly holes in it. The place was a 2-seater. What was the idea? Bring a friend when you take a dump? In one corner was a massive spider web, although I didn't see any spider then. I thought about brushing it away, but I actually didn't want to touch it or even get too near it. It was huge, and I could only imagine the size of the spider that made it. The other thing I didn't see was any toilet paper. Luckily, I did find some in the cabin. No way I was going to use that disgusting thing. I even contemplated getting in the car and driving back home. But I was sick of my pad, and so I decided to stick it out. It is called roughing it, eh? But I planned to be there for at least 4 days. No way could I go that long without going. And eventually I did. But in daylight. I used the whole... I sat as far from the spider web as possible. The spider put in an appearance the instant I sat down on the cold, hard plank. It was huge, hairy, and British racing green, and it sat there in the center of its web, regarding me with malevolence, indifference. Whatever it was, it sat there, completely, ominously still. Bottom line, I didn't linger over my business. I tried to find out what kind of spider it was, of course. But let's face it, unless you're an expert, they all look alike. Besides, the internet is really slow out here. 20 miles out of town, and it was dead slow. Dead slow. Oh well, I came here to catch up on my reading. Unfortunately, the only books I brought were Lovecraft and Kafka. Hardly uplifting. Still, I settled in, and after the first day, a miraculous thing began to happen. I began to relax, but I continued to avoid the Biffy at night. Until the second night, when I went a little wild with chili and red wine. I tried to ignore the effects at first, but by 9 o'clock, when it was full pitch dark, out there in the country. I was cramping so bad, I knew I wouldn't make it till morning. I would have to use the outhouse. I hoped the spider was asleep. I took a flashlight with me, of course, and sure enough, the big green spider was there. It must work a 24-hour shift. However, my business was pressing and extremely noisy. But once it was finished, I felt a sense of both relief and well-being wash over me. Talk about finding joy in strange places. In fact, I felt so much better, I was unconsciously lingering, and even felt some benevolence towards the spider. When something hit the wall of the outhouse, something big and heavy. It sounded like a rock. Did someone throw a rock at the privy? But who? Kids? Some teenagers trying to prank me? But I hadn't seen a soul all day. This was the middle of nowhere. What if they knocked the outhouse over, with me sitting there, with my pants around my ankles? I suddenly remembered some lines of bad poetry I'd read somewhere, maybe on a washroom wall. So if you use an outhouse potty made of old planks slightly knotty, beware when you are snug inside of beasts that lean against the side. I listened, but I couldn't hear anything. And, in fact, I couldn't hear anything at all. Everything had gone dead silent. I couldn't even hear wind. Outside. I suddenly started feeling like I was participating in a cheesy horror movie, and figured I'd better get back to the cabin quick. The spider was no longer my biggest worry. But then I felt the spasm of another cramp, and for the next few minutes, I was busily engaged. Never mix red wine and chili. And so I was still engaged when another stone or whatever smacked into the outhouse wall. I felt several conflicting emotions: embarrassment, anger, and fear, which caused me to yell, "Hey!" I waited, expecting to hear laughter or something, but instead, what I heard was someone whistle. It seemed to be coming from off to my right, and was almost immediately answered by a second whistle, coming from the opposite direction. And then, off in the distance, came a third. So there were 3 of them out there. Another rock hit the side of the outhouse. Then it was sprayed with what must have been a handful of pebbles. I had to get out of there, whether I shit myself or not. But I didn't want a bunch of punk kids seeing me run bare-assed back to the cabin, leaving a trail behind me like I was Diarrhea Dan or something. The whistling had been going on the whole time, over the other sounds of, you know. But now there was still another sound. Approaching footsteps. Heavy, ponderous approaching footsteps. These weren't the footsteps of kids, but of grown men. Big men. Big men with evil intentions. And here I was, stuck on a kaibo. Something smacked the wall. A hand which had to have been massive, judging by the force of the impact. It made the walls shake, and then I felt other hands touching, smacking, shaking the walls, until I felt like I was trapped in a blender. And then I realized they really were trying to knock the outhouse over. I was yelling and swearing by then, as I wiped myself and tried to pull my pants up, but my shouts got a response I sure wasn't expecting. A series of loud screams and growls, far louder than me. Just what the hell was out there? The privy was beginning to tilt at a dangerous angle. I threw open the door and began to stumble towards the cabin. It's hard to run with your pants around your ankles. I tried to look behind me without falling on my face, but of course, in all the excitement, I left the damn flashlight back in the biffy. But in the darkness, and it sure gets dark out in the country at night, I could see huge shapes moving around. Could they be bears? No way! Bears don't whistle, and they sure as hell don't throw rocks. I managed to get back inside the cabin, hearing heavy footsteps behind me all the way, and 10 seconds after I slammed the door closed, something smashed into it so hard I was sure it would burst open. I stood there in silence, hardly daring to breathe. I could hear them moving around the outside of the cabin now. Then heavy paws or feet stamping across the porch. My pants were still around my ankles. I was covered in shit and I'd pissed myself. Outside the things. Were they Bigfoot? I didn't know we had them around here. Outside the things continued to walk around the building, hitting the wall and throwing rocks. And then, in the window, at the front of the cabin, I saw a pair of eyes. Red eyes. They were huge, and at least 3 times the size of a pair of regular human eyes. I could not make out a face in the Stygian darkness outside the window, but the creature was obviously humanoid, and I became terrified that it was about to break the glass and get at me. I retreated into the inner bedroom, which lacked windows, and shut the door. Not that it offered me any protection from beings which could make the cabin shake with their pounding. I cowered in sheer terror and lost control of my bowels and bladder. Again, I heard the sound of breaking glass. And then I heard drumming. Drumming! I was sure of it. Could these things actually be human? Or partly human? The pounding and the stomping went on all night, but morning finally came. For a long time, I didn't dare leave the bedroom, but eventually I cracked open the door. The front window was broken. Glass shards covered the hardwood floor. But it didn't look like the things had attempted to come inside. Outside, on the porch, the front steps, all around the outside of the cabin, were big piles of dung, as if my assailants had added insult to injury by defecating. The outhouse had been completely turned over, leaving a big, smelly hole in the ground. They had smashed all the windows of my vehicle and left great dents in the hood and along the sides where they had pounded it with their fists. But it was still drivable. I ran back inside the cabin to grab my stuff and was hurrying towards the vehicle when I heard someone, or something, whistling from the trees. And then I was hit on my arm by a rock. Joseph was reported missing when he failed to participate in a Zoom meeting. The friend who had loaned him the cabin went to investigate and found the place trashed, the outhouse overturned, and his friend's vehicle, which was still drivable, with all its windows broken. But a subsequent investigation by the provincial police failed to find the missing man, and Joseph remains missing to this very day. The moral of the story? If you have to go, go at home, where it's safe. Unless it's really true that snakes can climb up through the pipes and bite you on the... If this is your first visit to my channel, please consider subscribing. My name is Warren, and I write and tell original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the night floaters, werewolves, and the black-eyed children. So again, please consider subscribing. Please help me to reach my goal of 2,021 subs in 2021. Till midnight. Cheers. Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pxhere, that's Pxhere, while the music was the incredibly eerie The Dread by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.